you don't support the current approved plan for Brooklyn Bridge Park, saying that you do not support development in the park, from which its revenues would be used to maintain and operate the park. You argue that Senator Connor has failed to muster the funds and the political will to get the park built, and that you would apply your vision and experience to build a real Brooklyn Bridge Park. With the park site undergoing destruction and about to begin construction, could you explain your position? Particularly, how would you ensure that the park has the necessary funds on an annual basis to pay for its operation? In answering, tell us how you would have handled Brooklyn Bridge Park differently from Senator Connor, who is often credited by some with being a key point person in persuading the various stakeholders to support the park.
Well, I have talked about my position on Brooklyn Bridge Park a lot. You and I have discussed it a couple of times. I see a number of faces in the room with whom I've talked about this. It's an incredibly important issue for the neighborhood, for really the Brooklyn part of the district, and I would argue for the city as a whole, for the waterfront. I believe, and I've talked about a vision which sees Brooklyn Bridge Park as a foothold to a great harbor park, a central park for the center of the city, a grand 21st century vision, just as Central Park or Prospect Park were, along with Governor's Island, Hudson River Park, East River Waterfront, all of course in the 25th Senate District, which is the center of the world, lest you be confused. The fact is, I have said, and I believe strongly, that we should not have any more housing in the park. I don't believe we should have housing in parks in general, and I believe that in this case in particular, the plan for the new luxury condo towers within the park, I think, risks turning this park and this potential to be, as I say, the foothold for this wonderful 21st century vision for our harbor into something much less than it could be permanently, and really risks turning it into a de facto backyard for the residents of those towers whose tax payments or payments in lieu of taxes will go to fund the park. The fact is, I've also said that I do understand the original 13 guiding principles talked about the sustainability. In fact, they talked about the fact that residential was the least favorable form of revenue for this park. And so I've talked about things like a hotel and event space. I've talked about things like active recreation and exploring whether they can raise revenue. I mean, the fact is, I've also called for opening up the books on what the operating expenses look like, what the revenue streams look like, so we can have a completely open discussion. And what I would have done differently is there were at times wonderful community processes for defining and creating this vision for the park. At some point, the towers were then thrown in. And I believe, especially on Pier 6, although elsewhere in the park, we really need to have a community-based plan. And we need to have a much more open community process for what this park is going to look like, make sure it really can be the real world-class park that it needs to be. The fact is, we today do not have the funds necessary to fully build the park in its current plan. Nor do we know whether we have what the revenue streams look like today in terms of operating the park. So I've been very clear. We must build it now. I'm not someone who supports stopping it now. I'm someone who supports moving forward with the parts that we have funded that we can do without putting housing inside that park, because once we've done that, I fear that we've lost the park permanently.
Senator Connor?
Quite frankly, Brooklyn Bridge Park is another reason I'm running for re-election. Dan talked about the guiding principles. I was there when we hashed those out among the community stakeholders and the elected officials of the time. And he's correct that housing was the least favorable alternative. It wasn't ruled out, it was just least favorable. But those principles also said that you could have development up to, I think it was 40% of the footprint of the park to sustain the park. The current plan is less than 10% of the footprint. That's the good news. I don't particularly favor housing. It was presented to us by the state as the only way to make the numbers work. The community planning process, in which thousands participated over a period of time, I'm very proud of the fact that I secured the funds, together with Assemblywoman Millman, nearly $2 million, to pay for that community planning process. And I take a little umbrage when my opponent sends a letter out saying I did nothing to use my clout. I'm particularly proud of the fact that I persuaded Governor Pataki to commit $85 million in Port Authority money to build Brooklyn Bridge Park and the piers, the real estate. And I was leader at the time. I had a hotline to the governor, and I got him to do it. And it's a fascinating story how. And we're building the park, and I think anyone who can't answer the question, how will you pay to operate the park, is not going to see the park built. We're under construction now. We have to build it.
Your time is up. Thank you. No response? Okay.